So, hey guys, so this is the second part of this presentation based on this text Victor and I wrote on the movement of strikes of the delivery workers here in Brazil. Yeah, I think I'll just very quickly remember. So we did this quick. I didn't load it that well actually. Still loading, but yeah. So we went through telling a bit how this process we participated on was, and we discussed this diagram where we represented the basic political parts of the movement and distributed them in the parts that were more like interior to the movement, those that were in this so-called boundary of the movement, which got to interact between internal and external elements of the movement. And another thing we also explored was trying to sort of like parse these different parts in terms of the sort of social logic it functions based on Karatani's modes of exchange. So trying to understand which components were more community-based, so like meant to interact with, like the media and the consumers, those components that were more able to interact with more institutional or state-like components, and those that function on a more like value-based economical dimension that related to capital and the companies. So this was one of the aspects of the meeting, which led us to this representation where we get different components on the three different logics, and them distributed into interior and more interior aspects, which are related to the reproduction of the movement. So like the strike fund would be something that is something internally organized by the movement, and it functions in a it's a financial organization of some of value that gets distributed and is used to maintain. So it's a mode C related to like which is value related, and it's internal to the movement. You have like a institutional, like more or less formal organization of leaders of the movement that function as this sort of like power structure that's like a mode B logic that organizes the movement. There are all sorts of affinity dynamics inside the movement related to the way that the lifestyle of couriers that circle in the street and are connected to a certain territory function. And you also have the components that are at the boundary that get to interact and produce political effects in the world. So the strike itself would be this kind of like component of the movement that is used to interrupt the functioning of the app and of the city, so that it produces effects that are not just about the reproduction of the struggle itself, but of producing new effects, and both negative and also of sort of like not only like negative effects on the side of the social world, but also like reabsorbing, which we're calling consumption, into the movement to give it more like energy and more means to expand and grow. So this is the basic sort of scheme, which we're gonna explore more this meeting. So I'm gonna try to like push more like the motivation for this division between internal and boundary elements of political bodies, and tie them to the internal aspects being related to social reproduction, to the not social reproduction, but a reproduction of this body, and these boundary elements tied to some sort of production And it's a bit, yeah, I'm trying to motivate in different ways, with the argument that this could be useful to make sense of how you can create a new order which is not contained in the social world, but which still interacts. So what's the sort of operator that's able to sort of preserve an interior where a new sort of like political logic is maintained, and that still interacts in a way that produces effects outside of it. So it's, there seems to be like an important like qualitative and political distinction that I think it's useful to do between these two like terms. And I think there's also an argument that it's historically more, this internal dimension of reproduction becomes more and more sort of like apparent in concrete struggles nowadays for historical reasons. I don't know, Victor, if you want to say something like whenever you feel like.
I think just recapping, right?
Yeah. And then we went through this discussion on trying to map like a new, I'll try to do this quickly so we don't lose too much time, but we just went through this model of trying to like go past a more like a paradigm in which militants, because that, I mean, this is a part of what motivated the text, was to understand our role and what does even militancy means in this kind of struggle where the reproduction of these workers as militants became in crisis, and this distinction between militant and worker was always like put in check, and so we tried to like go towards a model which we call it like militancy as a sort of exchange or intercourse. Maybe I think we can go back this in the discussion, because I wanted afterwards to maybe discuss like how much of this could be related to like stuff we did regarding the social mediation part. So whether there is a counterpart of this basic idea that a political mediation is one which is not contained in the relationship between the individuals and the social world. We could also think about like mediations within a movement between militants, which sort of like fall back towards the social world and get sort of recuperated and sort of like depends on this social underpin. So there will be like a duality between these two perspectives, between political exchanges and between militants that exchange things that have a social value or social valency. But yeah, but to get to advance a bit on what we did. So we discussed also like how this militance in this case can be like, according to these two sort of like ideas we put forward in STP regarding, like the Trinitarian, this three-valued logic of these three social logics. We would have like political work that's specific to maintaining affinity networks, political work that is more like contract-based, that's logistical, and political work that's responsible for structuring, value structures, and how we can also like decompose political work into this three dimension that are like consistent with the organization of Trinitarianism. So talk about like cartographical work of making like aspects of the movement represented, compositional work of connecting heterogeneous elements of the social terrain and producing effects by connecting them, and sort of tactical innovations based on producing new interactions between components of the movement. Yeah, so that's what the last meeting was about. So at this meeting, I put some quotes of the text to sort of like guide us a bit. I don't know if it will work well, but it's also based on the translation that it was, it's not a final translation in English, but so we start the text with this discussion of differentiating defeats from failures. So maybe I can read a bit. So I mean, we wrote this text on like when we were like feeling a bit depressed about what happened after like 2 years participating. Everyone was like tired and exhausted and trying to understand what went wrong. So so it's that moment of writing the text is also an opportunity to distinguish defeats from failures and the particular forms of anguish they produce. Whereas defeat comes from their world's external victory over the movement and places before our enemies, failure is the movement's internal undermining of itself and places before ourselves. The mourning that follows defeat, because since after all we have lost, is the collective inscription in something that did not happen but was glimpsed, the invention of an emblem for that which was missing at the border of the movement, between it and the world that was glimpsed. In the abrupt passage from the potency into impotency, there was a desire that did not find its measure and awaits to be symbolized. Failure, on the other hand, is the unwanted result of the internal constraints that the movement chose to impose itself, of a discipline, therefore. Principles, organizational means, tactical and strategic choices. The causes of failure appear within the movement, everywhere and therefore nowhere, like a house about to collapse. The malaise of failure tends to appear thus as an excess within the movement that is without a place. So yeah, we made this distinction a bit to locate spatially a bit. I think it ended going towards this sort of like spatial interpretation, whereas this experience of defeat is towards, you know, like an enemy, some sort of like external thing that you experience this sort of like defeat and failure, and you feel impotent and you feel melancholic because suddenly, since you have no control over this, you stop making like producing effects towards this external world, you feel you're impotent, so this external element, the world, can have any size, right? So this leads to all sorts of like experiences of you know, feeling like shit and melancholic and like we're impotent and so on. But there seems also to be like a different dynamic which of effects that is related to this experience of failure, of internal failure. Like we could have it's problems and sort of like symptoms that appear internally, like and that leads to splits and leads to like blaming people inside the organization, inside the movement, or tendencies that were like building, but it's relating to the internal like structure of this movement, the sort of like what lacked in terms of what wasn't like counted, that what wasn't that was making a difference within the movement, that but wasn't properly sort of like taught and organized true. So so we have this basic diagram where we locate this internal failure, experience of failure within internally in the movement, which leads to and on the boundary of it, this sort of like dealing with the outside and this feeling of impotence. And I guess we also like diagnose two sort of like dynamics in which the boundary, on one hand, it gets sort of like more strict. So you get this sort of like defensive preservation of the interior, where you try to like purify yourself by this sort of like contaminated tendencies. So you get sort of, in both cases, you get like the cynical undertone, but on one hand, you sort of like try to preserve this internal space in a stronger form, and sort of like kick out any sort of like external elements. And we could also like locate in the movement those that took like a different route, right? So because we weren't able to sustain like our movement, it's because this boundary doesn't even exist. Like it's at the end of the day, it's a bit like the same. So we could interpret this as sort of like a weakening of the boundary, where there's a more like cynical pragmatism in which like you just just continue and move on, like many like careers did. It's just like, yeah, we're prepared to accept like compromising and like interacting with like things that we weren't before and so on. And I think also like different reactions in terms of yeah, of routes that subjectively like militants took in terms of like reaffirming like a compromise with, you know, like the state and mechanisms that were already available in the exterior versus those that retreated on like different, like more like try to preserve the interior by sort of like defending like just we have just to wait the next big event, and just, you know, you end up in this almost like mystical state in which you just like have to wait the right moment or and so on. But I mean, it's just like trying to a bit describe the more effective subjective dynamics in a bit of topological terms. I think the more positive like diagnosis we make is also locating like in the context that we were part, how this sort of constant experience of defeat led to the development of a notion of militant investigation that was very productive, of trying to understand then what is the social terrain like. So trying to map out this social terrain was, and this is something that we also locates at the boundary, right? Something that you have to get to interact with the terrain in order to learn something from it. But we oppose this experience of failure in terms of having also to open up a different kind of undertaking, which is we call like organizational experimentation, which is actually to reflect upon these sort of internal practices, and not only the new social forms, but also like the new organizational forms that we're able to affirm within the movement. So, and then I'm just going to read this paragraph. After all, there's a big difference between the conflict that explodes as class antagonism between bosses and workers, and the conflicts that implodes relations between workers and militants at the core of their social reproduction. While the former is a problem for them, the latter can only be a problem for us. Yet historically, this internal conflict tends to be read as the expression not of a social fracture, but of the diversity of political tendencies that are actually contradictory to each other within the movement. So there was, I mean, an attempt on the movement trying to read out like conflicts within the movement that's just, oh, you know, this is a more like a tendency that's more like radical, or this tendency is politically expresses some sort of like conciliation. But I mean, at the end, it was just like people that were just like, in many senses, just exhausted and broken, and, you know, like you couldn't really like just reduce it to like political expression. There were like more problems and dynamics going on. It turns out that the crucial backdrop to the modern experience of this contradiction up to the 90s, an underlying structure which automatically politicized the conflict and made this negation productive, was the process of social homogenization operated by the Fordist Organization of Labor and the Keynesian management of the state. At the time, it was as if the social organization of labor, with a view to exploitation, had the side effect of also providing the means for the workers to organize themselves, distilling the social conflict into intelligible political tendencies. So the experience was that there was something on the social terrain that we couldn't count anymore, that seemed to previously produce, you know, like organized social movements and clear sort of like orientated and directions that could sort of like endure through time and through in sort of like intelligible political tendencies and so on. So if these social conditions weren't present anymore, then it's on us, on the side of experimentation, to sort of like probe new ways of producing this consistency again, and on the other hand, to sort of understand what went different. So that's why we oppose this experimentation with investigation. yeah, this last paragraph and talks a bit about this, what was I was talking about, right? This more concrete experiences that we saw in the ebb of the movement. So we get what we wanted, the struggle, the conflict, but not what we desired, the struggle against the bosses and capital, rather than among ourselves. Yeah, so this idea of this dialectic without dialectical movement is something that I wanted a bit to also discuss a bit later. And so this, I mean, summarizes the two notions. So political experiments would be the practices of experimenting with the internal composition of a political body, stabilized by a boundary, of producing new phenomena that puts the communist hypothesis to test, the hypothesis that the power of its internal composition under the trace can be greater than that of the social world. While political inquiries would be the practices of investigating and intervening on the composition of the social world at the edge of the political boundary, of incorporating new material into its internal composition and debasing the social world by testing the connections, the connecting social elements to the political body under the trace. I don't know if, yeah, that makes sense, but yeah, so again, we are mapping this sort of like different political operators into a sort of like topological, trying to bridge this. And then there's a third sort of like reading of this topological interpretation. So the first one was the more like effective, the second, the effective and more related to the negative experience of the struggle. The second is this more positive dimension of a political method. And the third is the one that relates to the social reproduction and production part. So it's a more like, I think it's a bit more hypothesis. I don't know, I'm not sure if it makes sense, but so we end up this section with, but how old are these problems? One clue that helps us think about this impasse is Marx's definition of the proletariat, which is both that of historical formation and of its logical genesis. For him, the proletariat is constituted by a double freedom. In the first place, the freedom to enter into contractual relations, to negotiate and sell oneself as labor power. On the other, the freedom given by the dispossession of the means of production and social reproduction, whose tendency is to put him on the verge of survival, so as to force him to sell his labor force and enter into a relation of wage earning. We can call these two conditions the autonomous condition, so this condition at the boundary, which makes the worker enter into this and interact into the market of, and be able to sell it himself as a, how do you say, workforce? Labor power, and the precarious condition, this negative condition on being dispossessed of its internal composition that would otherwise allow him to socially reproduce without having to engage in the capitalist world. So you have to have both conditions, right? You have on one hand this formation of the sort of like the formal liberty to sell oneself as labor power into a market. So this interaction between, you have to remember what this diagram meant, but this is the worker, this is the means of production it produces, and this product is sort of like alienated as a commodity, and then you have the famous, like money plus money, so on. And you have here the worker being divided in, so here is, I think it's him as, produced as a worker, and there's this whole internal circuit of, that is this sort of like, in a sense, non-capitalistic, because it's the internal subsistence that he's still able to use. So the history of this dispossession, which is the primitive accumulation, right? So this dispossession is this dual history between debasing the internal structure of this proletariat and forcing him to sort of like live at this boundary. So that's, I mean, this at least this is the argument. And yeah, so you could organize this again like this, which so you would have like this negative definition of a proletariat where you have this double, double freedom or double negation. Yeah, this double freedom. It's called the dispossession of means of subsistence, which leads to this precarity, which limits the sort of like social reproduction of the worker and forces him to live at this boundary and sell his labor power in the market. And then we could put forward that then there are two political tasks related to each one of these aspects: that of organizing this precarity, of sort of like producing again this common means of social subsistence, which can call commony, and in the work of affirming this boundary of a real autonomy, so like a real sort of like power at this boundary of a real freedom that happens at this boundary, that like recent militant theorists have called. I mean, I got to interpret it as communization, because it's this, what they call it, like this movement that immediately destroys and also like produces new conditions for the world. I think it makes sense to like locate it at this boundary, which is because it's normally a thought that tends to think movement in terms of this relationship between destruction of this capitalist work and immediate sort of like imposition of new conditions. But I think it normally leaves out a thinking about how this internal structure of the movement has to like be structured in order for the movement this communization movement to expand. So, and there is like others who like talk about like the commons and so on. And I think you could like map these two tasks in this still in this topology where you have the political body, which is with its internal composition and with its components that get to interact with the world. Okay. Yeah, so just a last paragraph from the text, which grounds a bit this experience. To investigate the struggles in today's infinite hustles is also the experience of the infinite work involved in them. Now, insurgency and proletarian organization have always demanded brutal effort. In physics too, labor is energy transformed, that is discipline and affected into movement. Thus, the statement runs the risk of being rhetorical or a generality if it's not taught, and like why did this problem appears? It is at the moment in which the reproductive and productive spheres become distinguishable, as well as the boundary between working time and free time, that social reproduction becomes an eminently political issue, and the freedom that characterizes militancy takes on the contours of work. The politicization of the reproductive sphere and the reproduction of striking workers is not a new problem for feminist thought or for the women of those workers. But these problems burst open just when the boundary that contained them breaks it down, a boundary that kept the domestic and anti-political space of reproduction separate from the productive sphere within which politics emerged. Yeah, so I mean, recent processes of family of debt that we see, like in especially in peripheral territories, financialization of land, banking, the generalization of banking, monetization of community relations, all this I think is very like related to the our peripherization and vulgarization, thesis, and the informalization and flexibilization of work. This all sort of debases again this reproductive sphere and sort of like brings it out, and so on. Yeah. So so if you put everything together, like this, regarding the political method, you would have like this negative experience, the more like constructive part that we have been like discussing about experimentation and with the movement on the careers and the people that Victoria militate with try to develop this idea of investigate, this operaist idea of investigation of the workplace. And again, these two definitions of proletariat, one a negative one and affirmative one, trying to sort of like fit on this thing. Yeah, and so this is a bit this first part of that organizes a bit all the many sections of the text. I think just realized this later actually. And then yeah, then the second part of like what's the remaining section is a more speculative section in the sense that it's speculative because it's a bit more philosophical, but it's because it's just like just thinking out loud a bit, which tries to motivate this and relate it to Badiou and try to like make it argue that this is consistent with, which is always nice to that it's consistent with with what like Badiou's have been developing. So I don't know if should we discuss if I want to like questions or discuss it just a bit, or otherwise I could just yeah.
I have maybe a quick question. I'm a little unclear how you're associating commoning with the affirmative proletariat of the reproduction of struggle, right? Because you said that was the going against the organization of precarity. So maybe I'm just missing how that's related to commoning exactly here, misinterpreting. Can you just tell me a bit more about that? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. So I feel it's basically just the idea of trying to, I mean, as far as I understand the idea of commoning, but it's basically trying to organize a space where you have like common means to socially reproduce again, right? So reverse dispossession and sort of like reappropriate lands and commodities that were like privatized and dispossessed, and sort of like reclaim them and socialize them, right? And make into common goods that can be used for social reproduction, for again as a sort of like non-capitalist reproduction. So and I think that's a similar problem that experimentation as defined like this puts, right, of trying to reorganize. So I mean, I think there are two things. One is how do you reorganize how do you organize in precarity? That's one thing. The other is how do you get to like this reappropriation of material from the outside. So I think it's actually two things, right? One thing is it's related also to how you get stuff to, how do you like claim new material from that was lost, like lands that were privatized, like transport, like public transportation that got privatized, how you claim that back and socialize it again. So that's what commoning would be, this organization and reappropriation that produces a new sort of like organized material that structures the internal organization of the body, while communization would be this more like strict relationship to the external world, which is negative, and also like you produce some sort of like reorganization, external organization that is felt as a destruction for the capitalist world, and you sort of like consume this negative production as sort of like reappropriation. So that would be this arrow that goes back. And I think, yeah, I don't know if it makes sense, this parallel, because this part is not in the text.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. Thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask something. You might go into this once you get to the more speculative part that connects to Badiou, but I think, could you go back to that diagram that has the interior, the border, and the outside with the three similar diagrams of of K, you know, like the movement. Not
this one.
The previous one where you had like the modes for the interior, the modes for the boundary, for the modes for the, yeah, this thing here. I was thinking because there's something weird in this way of presenting it for me. Yeah, this is the best one to do it. There's something weird in this way of presenting that I think reflect. I mean, it might be just a issue of just kind of synchronizing the way we would write these things down. So it might not be a conceptual. It might not change much conceptually, but I have the impression that it might a bit because of the following. I wonder when we talk about the interior of a political body, meaning the thing that is separated into some type of connected thing that we would say, here is this, the core of whatever political is going on, that it should be describable in terms of the modes. I'm just thinking, for example, in a certain sense, you could say that all these things are kind of here. And so where do I want to get with this? Is that I have the impression that you shouldn't have to write 3 diagrams for the discussion of, like 3 diagrams that are constructions based on the social modes of intercourse. Probably you could have just one, right? Using like, actually, would you mind going to like a blank page or a page with less stuff, just so I can like put something on paper? Yeah, just go up, it's fine. Yeah, so my point is you could have something that's more like this. I'm not going to write like the arrows correctly, but just so you know, right? And you have B, whatever makes B remain B, that's its interior. And all the arrows from B to everything that composes the world, those are, let's say, are delta arrows.
So I see.
Delta is the set of all arrows that connect whatever is interior to B into the world, right?
Yeah, I think that would totally work.
Right. I mean this is.
You could also draw B as a structured thing, right? You could decompose B.
Yeah, I think so. I think, for example, if you look at this, if you project B into these arrows here, you would get something that, I mean, I more and more I like the fact that this kind of diamond shape looks like a conduit, you know, like you want to write all these functors coming here, and it looks like a little conduit with some thing in the center, right? So you could kind of just look at this thing here and see how it connects with the way that it kind of is negating or tensioning all these different modes and things. There's still the added problem, which I don't think we're addressing, that to arrive at a transcendental structure and to arrive at a composite, because this arrow goes here and this arrow comes out here, this is not the same. So there is some interesting details to work through there, which I'm not clear on. So this might at first look like just a simplification, like just a different kind of description of the same thing, right? So isn't this just saying, okay, the interior is whatever inner structure this body, this political body has. The boundary is just the set of all transformations that tie and separate this body and the world, and the exterior is just a set of everything that keeps the world in tension with this thing, right? Which, I mean, is very similar to what you were saying. Where I think things get a bit different is that from this drawing here, you can distinguish 2 things that I have the impression you guys are not distinguishing very clearly, but when you describe it, it's at stake. The one thing is what we could call sites. And from our theory, we have we're in a much bigger pickle than Badiou, because for Badiou you have one logic, and then you have the thing that doesn't fit that logic very well, that is kind of going under the radar, and that's the site. But for us, sites are complex, meaning something that is at the very limit of what commodity logic can capture can be very well at the center of what families can capture. So just because you are at the edge of what gets commodified in the production sphere doesn't mean you're at the edge of patriarchy, for example. You're very much at the center of it, for example, right? So just because you're at the edge of being counted as, you know, something for the sake of capital doesn't mean you're not clearly counted and accounted for socially by the state. So sites, we never developed this properly. We hinted at it in a couple of places, but I think we have something we could call, like, oh my God, I'm not sure how we want to name this, but like, okay, absolute sites. You guys just allow me to use the forbidden word, right? You have absolute sites, which are sites for all logics. Whatever is going on there is not counted either as a communitarian, a state, or property, or value kind of situation. I mean, there are thousands of situations like that, right? It doesn't need to be political, but even in politics, especially in politics, it's hard to justify when you're organizing. You're not doing it for money, you're not gaining any property or status, and you're not necessarily making friends. So what the hell are you doing? So you can have things that go through all of that, but there's also relative sites, and Badiou doesn't have space for this, which are things that are sites in one layer but are not sites in other. That's the case, for example, of being, you know, uncounted, hidden at the layer of production, but very much counted in terms of how the sexual division of labor, patriarchal values, and so on structures families, for example. So you fall under the cracks of one logic to be very closely disciplined by another logic, right? So I think that this is a distinction that is relevant when you guys make the distinction between, like, I think this would come into play when you are making that negative and positive version of the interior. The negative interior sounds to me like a relative site, right? Capital is saying, fuck you, like, you take care of you, you do you, right? So like whatever familiar structure, whatever kind of illegal activity you're going to have to do to get by, that's your problem. Let the police take care of you. That's in no way the construction of a political body. Or, I mean, not necessarily, right? That can be just a relative site in the sense of that's something that is not being properly counted, measured by price, capital, the value of labor power. I mean, that's the classic social reproduction argument, right? It needs to be uncounted to be compatible with the rest of the capitalist world, but it's uncounted by capital, but very much counted by other logics, right? So it's not like free form, free for people to organize how they please. So I'd say that there is a part of the argument there that concerns relative sites. And what you guys are calling the body concerns things that are, I mean, they probably have to do with these relative sites, but they have more to do with these absolute ones, right? If you don't make this distinction, you fall more into the kind of Negrian position, more Italian take. You give it an Italian flavor where there's always a political body, because just surviving in capitalism is already to construct like the political body itself. The issue is that when you do that, the fact that relative sites remain ultimately within our diagram of modes A, B, and C, right? It's like negative on one, but very well established on the other modes. Like, yeah, you work for free, you do social reproductive work, care work, but you're very much being seen by the nuclear family, by the state, and so on. So for that negative, you might be able to write it only with the modes. But for the things that do have structure, but at the same time don't have, no, the things that really are at the interior of a political movement, they should have structure, but that's why it's experimentation, but we don't know what that structure is, right? So it would clarify why experimentation is needed and why it is here, because it has to do with like making this error intelligible, right? What the hell are we doing when we do this thing we're doing? Well, if it is just, let's say, a negative or weakened or vacillating form of the three modes, we would know the name of all of that. We wouldn't need experiments, right? So that seems to me to be the case there, that the fact that there is structure, but not of the three modes, right? That's why it requires experimentation. And the fact that, I mean, you would write the delta, the boundary, as arrows here. It would also clarify this sort of, rather than the weaker in-betweenness that in topological terms, it kind of looks, right? Oh, the boundary is at the level of the things that are mixed between the movement and the world, but it's actually the place of intervention, right? So it's actually the kind of if you want to picture some, if you want to give structure to a movement, you better project B onto these arrows than the inverse, possibly, right? Probably get a better picture of a movement by looking at all the ways it touches on the world, than by looking at all the ways it tries to maintain itself alive, right? Because has very little intelligibility for whatever world. So, I mean, there's quite a bit of nonsense in what I'm saying, probably, but I do think that it might clarify how these things fit together with the previous things we did, right? I mean, just imagine that somehow org would go here, right? At a very, very distant relation with B. And so, I don't know, like, I think it connects more easily with what we did before, and it solves this issue that you kind of already hinted at with the drawing you just did here, of like writing all these arrows from C to C to C, from A plus B to A plus B plus A plus B in all the different, like in the interior, the boundary and the exterior. Because once you do that, it becomes kind of hard to know what is the interior of. It's no longer written on the page, right? Whereas if B is, let's say, the interior of the body is the set of all structured relations which are not describable by A, C, and B, right? They are sustained by something else that we are constructing, that relates to the past, relates to what other people are doing. This is where the singularity should come in, like of what was actually done by the couriers with the militants. So I don't know. I'm saying this because I think it might also facilitate joining it with what Badiou already did, because ultimately for him the interior is an interior of points, not an interior of objects of the world, right? Like the things that you collect, I'm being very nerdy, right? I think the things you collect in what we call B is the set of objects that you've composed in a weird way because you're politically involved. So none of them would truly fit any of the modes, right? Like it's a work fund with that's not making money. So it's not really the logic of C, right? It's a family, but right. So that's the whole point, being able to add this singularity. And formally, I think it yeah, and I mean, you can call it mode D, but what would you have learned by just writing that, right? I mean,
could you repeat your distinction between absolute and relative?
Yeah, I think like the way of thinking about it is, for example, can you go back to that really cool set of diagrams with the that kind of cover the economic cycle, the productive cycle with labor power, means of production. Yeah. So, so for example, where I think the difference appears, it's true that we know that means of, I mean, just riffing off of our own kind of account of volume 1, right? We try to show in our text on this topic that the difference between means of production and labor power is that you can decompose means of production into parts, and all of them are priced, whereas you cannot decompose labor power into like the real parts that are priced, because labor power is not itself the product of composition of things that have price, like the Polanyi argument about fictive commodities and so on. So labor power is not made of commodities the same way that means of productions are made of commodities. So you can look into means of production and tear them apart and remain in the commodity world in a way you cannot do with labor power. So you could conclude that what's below this is a process through which something which is politically formed gets kind of co-opted by this form, right? So that this thing can conclude into the production of a commodity. But below labor power, you don't find something outside of capitalism, right? You find a citizen or an illegal, but both positions exist for the state. And you find somebody who is the parent or son of somebody who has some familiar communal relations. No wonder that the whole logic of, I want to push the price of labor power down because I pay equivalent to means of subsistence, and this can be driven down by competition amongst workers. Well, the surplus work that it takes, or the whatever you want to call it, the extra effort needed to keep somebody alive with less means of subsistence is now being distributed informally to their community. Yeah, but the logic of community is one of the 3 logics we're looking into. So neither in terms of their identity outside of production or below production, nor in terms of their community relations for the sake of remaining alive, having favors, accepting a certain subordinate position in a patriarchal domination structure or something like this. None of the 2 are without form in our account of of what a social formation is. They're both codified, right? So you would have something like, it's almost like you have a logic, it has a hole. So something can slip out, but it doesn't fall into a political body here. Before that, it is caught into a different logic that is below, right? And then returns up. Really proud of this little drawing I just did. So this would be a relative side. It's a side at one level, but not a side at another level. Whereas, does that make sense? So it would alter this a bit here. This is only from the standpoint of C, as you wrote here.
Yeah. I mean, that's what I was going to say. This internal is not like a political body. I'm not saying it's a whole with that is outside the sort of like logic of mode C. It pokes a hole. I'm just saying it's analogous. But you're saying that the absolute side would be one that pokes the 3 logics at the same time? Is that the point?
Yeah, I'm saying something like that. Like, for example, I mean, it sounds like, okay, so it's much harder, but it's actually, I think it's quite contingent. I think most of the things you guys discussed here don't fit any of the logics. No wonder they're not self-sufficient very easily and require some crazy effort. They are not reproducing people's familial, communal, friendly enemy relations. They're not reproducing relations of property. They're not reproducing relations of value. Most things don't reproduce those 3 things. That's not like the exception. Connecting things that don't reproduce these 3 things are hard, but not doing it is quite easy. No wonder we need like 20 years of school to learn how to keep up with those 3 things, right? So I'm just saying that perhaps that distinction is useful to tell apart why this structure here doesn't need to be developed exactly with the 3 modes. This structure here that you guys separated by the modes are actually just naming arrows that have this as their targets. Boycotts have A plus C as their target. They're doing like this. strikes are doing like this, right? Something like that. I mean, I'm considering that this is not revolution. I just thought this was the world, right? But you see my point.
Here's the world. No.
Yeah, but anyway, you see my point. Like, this is just naming, there is an arrow going from B, from the interior of B, through a strike, which is a transformation that is mapping this weird interior into mode C, right? Or vice versa, or however you want to account for it, right? There is, the boycott is doing this the same for A plus C, something like this, right? So this is actually composed of a set of arrows. This is composed of a set of self arrows. And this is actually, I mean, again, I got this wrong. I thought this was the regular diagram, right? But if this were the regular diagram,
but it would be this diagram that I was trying to draw, right?
Yeah, but instead of having it from the interior, I would have the interior structured whatever way it actually is, right? I mean, I think that this is important because, for example, we shouldn't, that's why I also have always this issue with, I mean, actually, it's a good opportunity also to see how this would play out. Like, for example, my opinion is that,
in the case of Guyana, for example, you have the families, they get together to organize a strike. So you have a direct.
Yeah. Like, for example, when the family is organized, what's the name of that? What is that? That's not a family in any recognizable sense. That's a new thing that people did there, right? So, you know, this is also, I mean, I really want to see how Anna would also approach this, because for me, this is the difference between, you know, at the level of the interior of a movement, you would expect to see everything that concerns it singularly. Like, this is how we did this, exactly how we did it. It shouldn't be substitutable for a manual for how things should be. It shouldn't be substitutable for, you know, a general description. It's the thing that is being done. You know, the closest we can be to its description is to be inside of it somehow, right? The arrows towards the world, which connected to, you know, different logics and different structures around the whole thing, they are kind of telling us something that might be a bit more general: tactics, strategy, relational forms between this very singular thing and the way that it's interacting with the world. And the world, when we talk about it, yes, makes sense that we have a structure to define it, because it's a very solid thing that usually works always the same way, right? So I don't think we lose that much if this thing here is not so clearly defined by the modes, or if, you know, something needs to be added to make it, to account for that added non-trivial aspect, which is what we're doing politically and why that's.
But I think, I mean, the argument I would try to make, like, for like keeping the structure of the internal body would be this, which would be like to say that from the point of view of the social world, whatever is not containing it appears as a singularity. Once you're inside a movement, you get to see structure that you can still call it like these modes. And I mean, maybe we should leave room for like mode D, or like for like some extra stuff that is not counted. But when you flip what I'm saying is that from the point of view of K, you only see singularities. But from the point of view of this sort of like postulated larger space, then this becomes just simply contain. It's just like this is like a strong, like I don't know if it's called like a stronger or weaker model, like a larger model of this. So you could still say there's structure here, like our organization includes all of this. And I wonder if we should have names for like this generalized logics, or be it more like less, like very, not even assume that it's the logic of this internal thing is functions in these three modes, but I mean, I wouldn't have that many problems.
I think
Just
my
saying that-
impression, yeah, I would just say something like, I think that what I really like this. I remember when you showed it last time, I think it was a good idea. I would just make a distinction.
like you could even put like this.
Yeah, I don't think that, I mean, you can call it D, you can call it X.
You really want.
Yeah, I mean, again, let me just suggest something like,
Yeah.
there are two interpretations of this. One that I think you guys are proposing that we never suggested directly, which is really cool, which is different, because when you look at our regular diagram, you have this thing, and you have, right, the sums, and the world is actually, you can derive from the world only the composites, whereas the pure form, so to speak, of the modes are composing the world, but you don't get them back directly. You can only arrive at mode C by first extracting something that has A and C mixed, and then removing C from it again, which is different from getting C as it goes into the world. So one interpretation of what you guys just said is that this is the political body is being composed straight from A, B, and C, while the world is you get to see it as being composed of A, C, and B, and BC. Right? Something like this, that you can make some distinction between this and this as kind of things you're playing with, right? Somehow, like, I don't know. And the other version, which I think is the more classic thing we've been following, which implies just some generic construction, which is you need A, B, and C, sure, because that's what the world has, plus a way of mixing these things together, which is not reducible to them. Like when I ask, but what is this thing made of? What's the normative reasons to do this? I won't find them either in B, A, or C, right? And then you have two options. You can say you found them on something which is abstract, which would be, in my opinion, mode D. Oh, I found them in the fact that this is more rational. I found it in the fact that, you know, this is what pure reason is according to, or because this is, let's say, something philosophical, whatever, or you can find it in more concrete things which are within your situation. I found it because there is an unjust thing happening here and now, or because it happened in the past, but nevertheless, you're pointing to a normative principle extracted from within a situation rather than a normative principle extracted from what normativity is. So this would be mode D, in my opinion. This is more philosophical, and this would be more political, like singular, right? But in either case, this diagram here does not include the answer to the question, where did you get the way you bound things, you decided to bind these things together, right? When you decided to trust that the families, when they get together of the couriers, they're gonna trust each other enough to create like a trust fund or a work fund, and they cannot use the law, they cannot, you know, base themselves on anything other than the trust that nobody's gonna rob anyone. Like, why are you betting on that, which has no proper justification? Like this version here with just A, B, and C would not include that, right?
So if I could jump in with something, because I had my name invoked, and this is very proximate to a lot of what I've been talking to Gabrielle about and working on. I actually kind of agree with the sort of abstract concrete opposition there and the sort of philosophy politics opposition there. I've kind of been coming around to a similar conclusion about some of the limits of Karatani and of mode D, but also like I think part of why I tend to frame it differently or like emphasize that dimension is because I see like both sides as kind of necessarily co-constituting. Like I don't really think that it works to just have that political side that is specifically indexed to some kind of concrete singularity without also being able to translate it outside of that concrete singularity. with some kind of abstraction that like allows other people who didn't necessarily have access to that to like index it to maybe something close to that then they could articulate in a different way in a different place. This is what I like about Karatani's like kind of universalism, I think.
Yeah,
Is that it
can I
allows
just clarify, just so I don't like sound also, I mean, singular doesn't mean that it's only in the people who were there, right? I mean, singular just means that you like the whole history of the communist movement is singular. Just to clarify the meaning. So, sorry, just to.
Right. No. I mean, I think that's a good point. Because I think I was focusing over much on the like concrete aspect, and like singularity I know is supposed to be like in a sense bigger than the universal. Like even Karatani will argue that basically, which is like exactly what makes it political. I agree. Like if you're talking about it without reference to like some kind of concrete practice, then it, it's not at as high level as it could be. I've actually been getting really into Simondon lately and his stuff about technics, because I actually feel like, in relation to Bogdanov's work and like the sort of organizational point of view that SDP has been developing, I think that that dimension of like, the abstract position through which not just this reference to the concrete situation, but the kind of like, means of translating that kind of sort of absolute site between different places. That kind of process requires a technics, right? It requires like a way of doing something. And like it requires some kind of like process of like constructing that as an apparatus, I think. And like you can talk about it in terms of organization, which has obviously this connotation of like political organization and groups that like do things collectively and accomplish things collectively. Or that also sort of almost has for me a kind of a like humanist edge to it, where it's like this is like, like people sort of doing things together, which I think is actually something that you do find in Bogdanov to some extent. I don't think he's like, you could argue, he's beyond the limit of anthropology because like Freud, he uses an energetics metaphor or something. But he also has these very strong humanist proclivities. Something I like about Simondon, though, is the stress that he puts on like the use of sort of techniques or like a technical apparatus in that kind of context, to like allow for like that kind of singularity, right? Or sort of, universalism at a higher level to like to flow, I guess, to like be articulable or translatable in a way that I think putting a certain amount of stress like on the concrete as opposed to the abstract can potentially also be like, even though it is emphasizing the political dimension, and that's a lot of what SDP is like, formed to do, and is like sort of the crucial thing I think a lot of other places are missing. I think it can also potentially undermine that political aspect if it's not like articulated through like that other abstract dimension or technical dimension, which is part of like what I have been trying to work out with like thinking about this in terms of like, I guess, what are some like, infrastructures similar to like what Karatani was looking at with the local exchange trading systems, for example, I think would be a good way of talking about like how some kind of process that, emerges at a particular site, which, there could be a structure that allows that to be translated within some limited way, between different sites as well. So I think I'm just trying to think about like, how could that concrete and abstract opposition be articulated, as well as like, how can we put the stress on the concrete that I think Gabrielle is like rightly making?
I'm also looking at this now. I wonder if this, I mean, I'm not sure if the idea I proposed is a good alternative. I'm just saying I can see benefits of that it would clarify some distinctions that might be a bit kind of condensed in what you're presenting, but I'm not sure if it's a good approach. One thing
I
that
actually
I'm
agree
not
with the idea, for the record.
the idea that I was mentioning.
No, yeah, I think it's an excellent way of framing it. Like I was with you pretty much all the way through. I'm just kind of adding what I think is why Mode D is actually like relevant to what you're saying, but I think it's actually a great way of approaching it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always in favor of mode D. My point is just how to build stuff, like to actually build it formally. And
Yeah,
my point is here, like looking back at what Renzo did, Renzo just making sure that, for example, you have like one arrow here from, right, the interior to the production of the struggle, from the production to the world. What I said might actually kind of undo differences that you distinguish. So I'm not sure if it's a good idea to go that way. You see, Anna, like the problem there is also this, like this thing here has a very neat distinction between I mean, I wonder if limitation and determination wouldn't become just the arrows from int to int.
Yeah, I don't know, but I'll try to argue again where this could come from, but yeah, that's
I mean, just saying that I think that everything Anna was saying and everything we're saying, intuitively, I think nothing should be lost. What I was looking at just going ahead to the point of actually trying to formally bind this back to the formalism in logics of worlds and bind it back to the things we did in our last paper. And just for the sake of the technical parts, that other version seems like it should be more natural, but then I don't know how to do that and also keep all the distinctions you made. And also the point that Anna was making, that for me, actually, what she was describing is just the self arrow here, right? Like you organize somewhere. Exactly, we did this. I mean, you can bring the techniques at exactly the things you guys were talking about. WhatsApp allowed, I mean, the text, you guys are very clear about the role of WhatsApp in allowing different groups separated who were already doing their thing to actually feed off each other, make it visible to each other what they were doing. So that's definitely, let's say, technical device put at the service of, you know, reproducing the struggle and also keeping some productive strategies alive and kind of allowing them to coordinate and so on. So we shouldn't take for granted that this is like a concrete thing that needs to be done, right? But that's for me ultimately the distinction, Anna, between, and the reason why, though I agree with this discussion, I'm still not very clear on why to prefer it, because real abstractions are concrete ways to move between concrete things, whereas philosophical abstractions, they just give you the connection. You know, because somebody did something here and somebody did something there, it's always already connected from the standpoint of God.
Well,
I don't care for that. Like, I want
really
you to actually
fast.
give me some WhatsApp
Yes.
names,
So,
you know?
the only thing I would say really fast that I think is the direction where my approach to this is going is that I guess it's the difference between stuff that is sort of in the situation versus stuff that like you can create in the situation. So partially why I'm focusing on techniques is that I'm interested in philosophical ideas. And so far as those philosophical ideas can actually be like invented and constructed and embodied in a techniques. Dennis, do you have your hand up? I was like,
yeah,
hoping to pass it off.
yeah, I was waiting for any response. Yeah, well, so I feel a bit lost in the debate, but I wanted to take a step back and maybe try to frame it in like simple language that I can understand. So from what I'm gathering from this discussion, we have K, or the world, right? And it has a lot of objects in it. And the modes, the way I see them they're like different types of glue, right? You have the C glue. It's good at gluing certain things together, things that have some kind of affinity, like things which, for example, can be kind of look or smell like money, right? Things that are money-like, you can use the C glue and attach them together. So like time is money-like because it has this thing we call like the homomeric property. If you divide time, you get more time, right? No matter how much you slice up time, you get something that looks like time. That's the same thing for money, right? You slice some money and it looks like itself. So because of that, the C glue works on it really well. Similarly with B and A, right? They're types of glue that work to some extent. And then when we say that one logic is dominant of the others, it's kind of like saying there's stuff that kind of falls out that don't really glue together that well. And in that case, the dominant logic is like the glue that we should use by default. It glues things when nothing else can step in to glue it. So when we talk about the difference between absolute and relative sites, to me, it's like mode C is already kind of mode C already kind of parasitizes or occupies these relative sites most of the time, because it's able to take what falls out of the other modes and glue them by tracking these homomeric things, right? But now moving on to this, like the interior of B, we're trying to say that there's some type of glue in B that's neither because B is not mode B, right? B is the body or this political thing. Inside of this political movement, there's a type of glue that we're looking for that Anna's been referring to as mode D, or Kartani refers to as like this other type of glue. And we don't know what that is. And I guess that's where I'm at in this discussion, right? Because I understand this, there's a distinction between the abstract and the concrete here. The abstract glue would be like saying, okay, we can glue it in our minds, in discussion, we can talk about communism as a topic and glue various things together with our words. But the concrete glue would be something which like actually functions in the world in terms of like what Anna's saying, techniques or a type of type of intercourse of goods and services and people and resources. So yeah, I think that's where I'm at right now. Does that make sense, or is that language helpful?
Yeah, I would just distinguish. My take is that, yeah, I think that makes sense. Though I would just distinguish. I mean, I really don't want to take too much time with something that goes off from the core of it. Just to make the distinction, the core of what I wanted to argue is that I think there are two ways of representing the difference between reproduction, production, and the counter-production schema that Renzo and Victor presented. So one of them uses the three modes for all the parts, the interior, the boundary, and the exterior. And the other version that I was proposing only has one description of the modes, which is when you talk about the world, and you describe the interior and the boundary with different types of objects in order to capture some type of extra distinction, right? And to argue for that distinction, I said, not everything that is outside of mode C is outside of the modes. So things that look like they are reproducing themselves outside, like, for example, the social reproduction of workers outside of a factory or something like this, or outside of what wage labor is accounting for, that's not outside of the modes. So you should actually put that back into the exterior. That's still part of the world, right? And it takes some added thing which doesn't have the structure of the modes to glue it. So it was just an argument for the alternative representation of the distinction between interior, boundary, and exterior, and the relation between that and the modes. That's my first argument. Based on that, we got into the discussion of should there be, going to another diagram that they did, should there be, do we need to add something to qualify that the interior has a separate logic. So in Badiou, the way that he does this to say, well, the interior is made up of all the political decisions we make. I don't want to predefine what were the objects, situations, context, technical means you used to deviate things from the regular path, things that require you to decide because they wouldn't go that way on their own. I don't care. That's singular. The set of all these transformations, that's what I call the interior, and that's forms a topology, right? So he doesn't go as far as saying that, well, those decisions are all decisions that have to do with how alternative ways of using the available glues, as you were saying, right? So the question is, do you need to make that more concrete and say, well, the interior, the essence of politics is putting into practice this isonomic mutual freedom kind of glue that we already know to exist. We know what it is. I recognize when I see it, right? Or are we saying that we don't even want to make that judgment? We might not recognize it when we see it. And it might not be freely immediately available. So the difference for me when I said concrete and abstract in the second debate was abstract in the sense of it's always already given because it is of the same order as the other modes. You don't need to build the existence of consistent logic, classical logic. It's already there. You can just use it. It's like a tube of glue. It's already in the package. You just use it, right? The difference is mode D, a logic we all have access to. It's like a religious, philosophical experience we have access to. It's old. It's kind of as transcendental as every other logic. And we can use that glue to build things differently. We just haven't been using it for some reason. Or there is no little glue box of this other thing. And it's just the way you're going to mix things together. And when you ask, let's say in a kind of meta way, how did you glue the glues? How did you decide to use this and that, focus on this and then on that? Well, you'll have to talk about politics. You won't be able to talk about social life, right? It won't be just a fourth mode of sociality. It was just going with the current of what free association is, right? I have the impression that that was the argument, that there is no readily available account of what it does mean to go with the current of free association. You always go, it's always like you need to build it. You need to glue what you have in a way that to account for it, you need to name the thing you're doing right now. But that's a separate discussion that I don't think yet has concrete reason like to develop further. But there's a separate discussion from the previous point about the two ways of accounting for the diagram of the interior boundary and the world.
Should we maybe move on a bit? These are wait, sorry, yeah. I mean, I think I'm trying to motivate in different ways because I feel it's trying to treat problems, these distinctions, I think are trying to treat problems that appear politically in both in like political thought and like in the world that in history, in the history of political thought, but also in the history of social formation, I think. So I'm trying to, I guess, motivate. And I feel that once in my experience, try to organize this and locate these different aspects, it helped in terms of making more stuff intelligible. But I realized that maybe it can also be a bit motivated philosophically because it sort of like rang the bell to me of stuff that I had read from Badiou, and especially this sort of like this scheme that he develops in the theory of subject, which I just read parts of it, that I wanted to also share in this last part. And let's see, what's the best way to, yeah, so I'll just recover some excerpts from Badiou where he sort of like discusses the dialectic, the problem of dialectics, and where he places himself regarding the dialectical tradition, which I'm not a specialist, but I think it resonates with I think the problems I'm trying to like treat with this scheme. Yeah, so he says on this interview, well, for Marx, the dialectical conception of negation defines the relationship between philosophy and politics, what used to be called the problem of dialectical materialism. Just as the party, which was once the victorious form of insurrection, is today outdated, so too is the dialectical theory of negation. It can no longer articulate a living link between philosophy and politics. So negativity, probably speaking, does not create anything new. So, and then he traces two sort of like roots, that elaborations of this dialectical framework that Marx sort of like deployed from Hegel's system. So one way was like it didn't work out, so we did more negation, just negated more, and then he would say that's Adorno, and that's problematic because it becomes aesthetics or like philosophy or like just, yeah, and he does this caricature, and then there would be this more like, okay, then negation, we have to like actually how do you say, like abrir mão, like just abandon dialectics, and then he puts out like the tracks of Negri and the more like positive, just like pure affirmation with no negativity. So I think, I mean, it's useful to situate a bit what I'm trying to argue. So I think it's I don't know if it's tenable, but I feel like in some, Badiou also periodizes this sort of like models of dialectics and of the organization of the workers' movement. So he talks about three phases of it: a first phase of initial phase of the social democratic parties. I don't know if this periodization is the best, but I think it can be still treated within the sort of like Marxist treatment of dialectics, which, I mean, it might be a character, it might not, I'm not sure, but it's normally presented in this, which is one of what Badiou calls one of the matrices of dialectical thought, one of the ways of interpreting what dialectics is, which is you have some sort of like negated term, and it has this negative relation to the world, which characterizes the proletariat, which we already talked about. He's alienated in his condition, and this position sort of like gives him some sort of like privileged position to sort of like negate this negation, and in this return he's sort of like realizes some sort of novelty. And so the whole like determinism and the whole like logical necessity of revolution can, I think, be captured a bit in this framework, where this antagonism produces this sort of situation in which this movement of return produces a new, like a sublation and so on, of a new world order. But that failed, in the sense that actually happened. Like, these parties took power, revolutions, like the regimes were overthrown, and proper like socialist states were achieved, and revolutions were done all over the world. And the history a bit of the 20th century is this experience of that didn't solve it. Like, we still ran into problems. So this body in these movements still, like, you had, it's just, it doesn't have like this pure relationship with novelty that just like affirms a new thing. It actually is susceptible to being reintegrated, and a socialist state is not necessarily like, it can be just a new way of managing capital. It's so people have called it like state capitalism and so on. So at this point there seems to be, I think, a new formulation, like, whereas you can split these two perspectives, you actually have a movement of So I think, I mean, this perspectival thing, I find it like present in, you know, the Italian autonomies. Like I think Tronti sort of argues this distinction between point of view of capital and point of view of workers. I'm not sure if this is what it means, but yeah, and in this model, which is, I think is consonant with the problem of sort of like, now we have a left in power, but we have to sort of like criticize it from within or from without. Like you have the problems of the communist parties in Europe. You have the problems of, you know, like the Soviet state, the problems of the Chinese Revolution and Cultural Revolution and so on. So the whole problem of having to deal with something that would be the political body of the revolution, but which has to be splitted in some sense or have to be sort of like distributed. It's actually like it falls prey to all these processes of reintegration, co-option, recuperation, and so on. And I think this view is like, yeah, it's still like in the negative thing. You have to go more negative, or yeah, you have to. History has to happen in a smarter way, but you sort of like talks about this third model, and I think his philosophy, which he says is a sort of like new way to preserve dialectics, and but where affirmation comes before negation. Yeah, I think, yeah, just let me just recover. So now trying to get back to his reading of Hegel, where I think it's nice because he uses, like, this is from the theory of subject. He says, in the peach there is still a kernel of the kernel, the bitter almond-shaped nut of his reproduction as a tree. So the boundary, I think this looks like a kernel of a kernel, but so yeah, he puts forward two models. So he tries to recover, from what I understand, like a different dialectical matrices, which is not that one of the alienation and return, right? Of negation and negation of negation, which is this first matrix. We must disentangle these two ones, and then he puts forward this dialectical matrix based on scission, which is, I mean, again, it's hard to understand, but it's basically this notion in which you divide. There's the division. It's not like alienation and a return. It's more like you have this concept that divides in the movement, that it's when it's placed concretely in the world. So it's subject to the effects of a structured place. So you have these notions of force and this relationship to the way it's placed in the structure and so on. So there's not the least bit of returning to itself, nor any connection between the final and the inaugural. Yeah. So yeah, and these are the operators he mobilizes and sort of develops his scheme. I found this a part of this text that where he also discusses this problem of the topology of the Hegelian philosophy. And again, it's a political matter again, right? So how do you make sense of the working class, which is something internal and external? And what else? Yeah, and then it's the scission operator sort of like is the sort of like solution to this. And so that's why I try to, it sort of rang the bell to me, in the sense that you have this first division, which holds organized antagonism, and then you could think about this further division of scission, and which still preserves these two matrices, in which you have becoming other, like, so alienating yourself in the capitalist world, which is the position of the proletariat, right? And returning, but then you have to deal with this sort of like the internal division of this body movement, right? It affirms a concept, which is, I mean, he formalizes that, but it's always falls prey to being determined by the social structure where it's placed and so on. So this is where this dialectic is sort of like maintained in the affirmation of like a new point, and the sort of like relationship it still holds to the world. So yeah, and then this third period would be the sort of like challenges that for Badiou the political thought has to face this, and be able to construct. And his philosophy is a bit like the whole world. The whole point of his philosophy would be to like treat that. So I tried a bit. I mean, it resonated. I don't know how much, but I tried to a bit to sort of like relate his schemes tentatively. So you do start with A that gets divided. So it would be like this A being divided, and then, yeah, I don't know if it works too well, but you would find the leftist, and yeah, it's hard to reconstruct this whole scheme, but you have at the end of the way things go wrong, which is like the rightist relapse, which just relapse back into the place. So A for him is, I think, is like the concept, and P is like the place. And then you have AP, A little p, which is like something that is placed. And then you have this dialectics where the something placed determines the concept, and the concept determines back, like the something placed. And yeah, the intuition is that something of this movement, which is not resolved in this relationship between B and K. And I think this also like goes back to that dual perspective of militancy that we were talking about, sort of like also works. I'm not sure if that's the best way to represent again. I mean, but and how we should like map stuff back. But in any case, like you would have like this move towards the problems of that are like that were witnessed by this whole dynamics of how you get like this struggle between, you know, like destructing and consumption that I was talking about, that I call communization, and being falling prey of being co-opted and repressed from the point of view of K. So this cycle versus this cycle, which is where the stakes of expanding or being defeated happens. And then you have this further problem that like we talked a lot about, of how you reproduce this space in this tension, of how you know, like produce commons, and how you reorganize precarity and so on. And which is the problem of, you always have to distribute. You have like objects that on one hand are part of the world, but sort of like are organized under a new singular sort of like principle. So the splitting of B, it would do this sort of work of on one hand being relationship and constrained and determined by the K, and on the other hand sort of like exceeding that and you know, like mapping this dialectic. Yeah, that's basically it. Like, so this last argument was a bit trying to motivate like why this philosophically and in political thought, why these kinds of problems we were talking about, I think, can be sort of like made more sense and weren't as present in, I think, maybe in 20th century and so on. Yeah.
Man, I was thinking here that I mean, I really like this last slide. Sorry, the slide, no, the one that all of this, but the one with the big pyramid, the pyramid scheme of struggle, and it made me think that, I mean, I think that we had some clarity for a while that even though there is something very useful and challenging in the best sense that you could get from like political philosophy from Badiou's work, that since the very early on, the question that we've been kind of looking for an answer, which is under which conditions is the way we discuss, work through, feel about political organization, in which way is this, how can we do it in such a way that we are in the same element of, you know, large structural transformations, economical structures and so on, even when we're talking about more restricted things. This question was always a question that was challenging to the Badiou environment, because Badiou takes, I would say that he says something untrue, but he limits his true statements to a very abstract level, where to say something true of a situation is already to be connected to something universal. And we added this idea that, well, we don't want something to be universal in the sense that it will remain available for future struggles, in the sense that the Paris Commune involved the thinking that remains available for future struggles, future communes, future movements, such a way that Lenin and Trotsky could be dancing on the streets because they lasted longer than the Paris Commune. There was a connection, even though there was no material connection, right? We were trying to bring in also a more clearly political economic sense of common, which meant, well, we want these singular processes, which are generic, which are challenging how situations are structured. We want to make explicit how they connect, right? And that's kind of a way of asking the question. Fine, this is a singular universality. This is a local process that within a certain situation has a common, touches on what is common to that situation. But we want to make sure, we want to start asking questions such as, can I expand that situation to consider not only Paris in 1870, but also, you know, what was happening in Latin America at the time, and still find, you know, still be able to track material connections between these things, so that the passage from this generic discussion of politics to the discussion of political economy, socialist transition, you know, alternative ways of organizing a social world, that these things become possible questions. So why am I saying this? Because I feel that even though you are tracking Badiou here and redescribing a lot of the things he did, from early on, you did something that was not in Badiou, which is an original contribution, which is to say, let's not just describe duality. I would put it in these terms now, looking backwards. Let's not just describe decision in a movement in terms of the tension between a generic dimension, which is the politically engaged, faithful development of this singular process, and it's outside the world. To make that distinction, we could only describe the interior of the movement and the struggle of its inner consistency versus the consistency of the world. You added the problem of boundaries by giving the inverse definition of a topology from the boundary point of view rather than the inside point of view, which clarifies, well, it put at the level, like it created a grammar for us to discuss tactics, struggle, contradiction, antagonism, where it's not just, let's say, the unsituated or the kind of metaphorized distinction between, to Badiou nerdy talk, the generic extension and the situation, right? Which was more like a clear-cut two things. We now have, with what you did, more tools to talk about the ins and outs of maintaining a movement alive. We could put like the part of a movement where everything in its vicinity is also the movement, the part of a movement that not everything in its vicinity is the movement itself. So it's the outside is the things you're struggling with, you're purifying, you're destroying or whatever, and the parts of the world which are not in the movement. So now we have like this extended thing. And I wonder if there is a description of these, let's say, affirmative dialectical challenges that he's posing that is also more in line with these additional tools, which were not in Badiou, and therefore probably are not in the way that he defines these broader philosophical challenges. And I think that it's interesting to see the way you propose a distinction, right? Because I think Badiou wouldn't divide the proletariat in the interior and its boundary. He would divide the proletariat between the inside the generic, meaning the way that it is bound together by new normative principles that concern justice, and the way that it's still grounded on that specific situation, right? It would be a classical distinction. There is the inside, and what's not inside is in the complement, which is the situation. Because we have many modes, and we know that it's not true that this classical logic will apply always, sometimes the boundary will have thickness, right? So you've added that, I think, but it also has perhaps a description, like it probably leads us to describe more concretely this added proposition we're making, which is, I think, singular to the project we're leading. Like, you know, I think that's why Badiou has nothing to say about the reproduction of a movement. He's very satisfied with just talking about, which is already a lot, militancy, political action. He does give us tools to derive the skeleton of an organization, but he doesn't really talk about the work of keeping an organization alive as being part of the struggle. So I wonder if, you know, to properly account for what you're proposing, we wouldn't have to also add something to Badiou's own description of affirmative dialectics, which I don't have a clear kind of one-liner to do it, but I feel it would be like a further step in the direction of the things we did. Like, you know, it's not enough for something to be universal, for it to be common in a particular sense that we're interested in, right? I mean, one thing is to be common at the ontological level, right? Like using the distinction he uses in being an event, like, well, for an inhabitant of the situation, you can dispose of some things that are in the language of it, the situation. But some things are happening, but you have no way of knowing, right? But formally, you can prove that it can be true. I think that there is some way of describing what we're looking for, and I mean, it does seem to be, you know, connected to the problem of economy, because I think perhaps that's what it is, right? I mean, to add to the description of a generic procedure something like the cost of actions, right? The reproductive effort. It's kind of to add like a sense of the costliness of what you do to maintain that interior in existence, and to connect it to other things. That mixture of reproduction and connection between reproductive things in reproduction, that's kind of an economic point of view, right? So it is kind of going from, you know, to get a political truth, you can go all the way to Badiou. To get a political economic truth, which is something slightly with more parameters, I think that's what you're going towards. I don't know. I just think that it, you know, it's good to make that clear, that you're arguing for something that is not written anywhere, even though you're using in a very cool way the stuff that's there, because people won't find it there when they go read it. It's in your very crazy head, which is, I mean, pretty amazing. But it's I think it's novel terrain, and though it's definitely compatible, you know, I think it's definitely compatible, but I think that we need a good language to name that addition more generally, like what is being added to all of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because Badiou normally in some articles he calls this the main operator of this affirmative dialectic subtraction, and then he describes it as this capacity to be a distance, right? A distance from state, which is, I mean, it sort of like relapses back to this interior versus exterior without like, it gets a bit lost. Like it's just about this distance between like not being caught up and keeping a distance from the state and capital, and like and that's what like affirmative dialectics is about. It's not destruction, it's subtraction, which is like affirming an interior. But I feel like something is a bit like
I think that you named it very now. Perhaps we could call it the difference between affirmative and compositional dialectics, because The two things I think we do, and I mean, it's been like a very intrinsic way of reading that I think it's very sui generis. I've never read anyone doing the same thing. The first is to read the statement, politics happens at a distance of the state, by taking the idea of distance, you know, more strictly, meaning measure, not meaning far away from. Far away from, like, it's not a matter of independent from so much as to give measure for, right? Well, the moment that you do that, suddenly Badiou becomes compatible with a metric, and therefore with like economy. So that sounds like a useful distinction between the subtractive part, right? Which we don't undo, but the question of how do you compose through singular universalities, right? In a way that is itself singularly universal. I think that's the added dimension. And at that level, you need to reintroduce discussions of value, of metric. What is the object that has some weird universal property that sees the political movement, right? So distance in subtraction, which is just to remove yourself, right? And the generic, which is immediately universal in its singularity. It's by very density of its subsets, it's common to the situation, becomes in this new thing I think we're doing, like, yes, it is singularly universal, fine, the Paris Commune, but, right, do the singular universal thing in such a way that it also serves as a kind of mirror to something else that is happening elsewhere, or that sort of compositional clause that I think we're trying to add, right? Which is, I think, ultimately a reason why one of the meetings we had about Rodrigo Nunes' book, we saw that we can pair up Rodrigo's construction with Logics of Worlds up to a point. The idea of body ends before the idea of political ecology, right? Political ecology allows the body to have a kind of weird multiple upward point of view. It can be more granular on top than the political body seems to be, at least in Badiou's conception. There is, I think that there is something singular. There is like a nice philosophical addition, which I think it's clearly at stake in what you're constructing. It's very much in line with everything we wrote about composition in the Atlas, when we wrote like the communist standpoint, the idea of composition. We went back to the Communist Manifesto and said, well, look, communism is ultimately the point of view of composing many political struggles, which don't have to, take that stand. So, but to compose it in the same element as those struggles, meaning it must be a material, technical, as Anna was saying, kind of compositional process. It cannot be, because they share the same spirit, or they kind of develop the same thinking in a certain situation, certain sense, right? So I don't know. I'm just trying to think through that. I think that there is I'd probably name something like, the difference in affirmative dialectics. You have the subtractive one, which can, for example, you can now define it, right? Subtractive dialectics is the one where every site is an absolute site, right? Because if you're at the distance of the transcendental of that logic, you are safe, you're outside, right? Whereas compositional dialectics cannot be sure that every site is an absolute site, because there are relative ones, meaning you are kind of not counted by value, but you're definitely counted by other forms of social domination. So you might need to compose a complex site that only by composing feminist movements against patriarchy with anti-racist movements, with strikes, whatever, in the aggregate, you produce something that is neither here nor there, That's definitely not in Badiou. And that's pretty cool, I guess. That sounds like I mean, we just wrote ourselves into the history of dialectical thinking. Like, and there we are in it. I mean, it's a good thing we're moving beyond the pleasure principle, beyond the reality principle, in fact. But I'm not sure if it makes sense to you guys. Like, it just seemed to me that there's I think that's where we're heading right now. Like making sense of that last thingy.
Yeah, I also had the impression that the decision in Badiou is, because it is like the subjective operator, it loses a bit. It could lose a bit this economic dimension that we were talking that we are concerned about, right? That this adding of the cost of doing stuff, of political work, of adding the economic in politics. So decision sort of like is a division, but it sort of like almost sits on top the material. So you cannot like locate that well, like the material, the compositional structure, right, of this.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me also because Badiou never goes, I mean, keeping in line with his own general commitments, right? His own personal commitments. I think that he's devoted to certain processes he was part of, and in those processes, the forms that have the shape of an interior are usually quite small groups. The largest thing he talks about in terms of a large process involving many people is like the Red Army. But other than that, I mean, and then it's an army structure, which is not exactly, that hard to pin down. It keeps the army structure. So the inner structure is not such a problem. So I think that he rarely concerns himself with the question, how must these people be related in such a way that can withstand being divided, right? Because it's more focused on the fact that the people gets divided, like the party gets divided by the Cultural Revolution. But the question of, okay, what's going on in China that they managed to divide the revolutionary process in two? Like there must be some infrastructure to that division, some, communal ties, economic structures that allow people to divide in such a way and still remain inside the movement somehow, right? I don't think that, the Zapatista movement, I think it's perhaps the biggest thing that I remember him mention. So yeah, I have the impression that the moment that we are trying to make sure we can move to larger scales of processes, at that point, sorry, yeah?
Yeah, so sorry. Yeah, this diagram, I had a question, maybe a naive question, Renzo. This is int b and ampersand b and moving to k. Is this relationship a relationship when mode D, assuming that mode D is what the destination is, mode D is established, or is it a relationship that the organization is moving toward mode D, or is it both?
I'm not sure I understood. You mean B or like both delta and int?
So maybe I'm not reading it properly. Like speaking of theory of the subject, Badiou names two subjectivation modes. One is the subjectivation, whereby a subject is basically realizes or recognizes its place, which is the out place in the placement of the world, and then is a subjective process, which is something before revolution and something after revolution, put it this way, right? So Badiou, in tandem with the new dialectic, says that what the regular sense of dialectic usually misses is it stops at where or when the dialectic is or when the revolution is successful, right? And it does not basically have abandon the operations that defines what he names subjective process. And that's a debate that he has with Lacan in terms of cause and consistency, so on and so forth, right? This is a big part of, and I think this is a big part of what leads his theory of the subject to subtractive ontology and affirmative dialectic, which is basically the logic that goes into subjective process. Now, I don't want to throw more terms at this. This is complex as it is. I just wanted to understand in my mind, in a simple way, that the way that I understand the project is that we are arguing for the symmetry, sort of a symmetry. I don't know whether this is the right word, between organization and politics, right? And this, to me, sounds like the organization that is being built, that pyramid that you showed at the beginning, that no, not this one. At the beginning of your, I joined late. I don't know whether it was at the beginning of your talk. Yeah, that one on the corner on the left. Go to left. Yeah, that's one. So there is an analogous structure between the communist organization and a communist society, right? So obviously, the organization on the left is something that is formed prior to the communist society. That's what Badiou would call subjectivization. And when this process is established on the right, which is the communist society, he calls it subjective process. So when you, in the other diagram, this is the structural diagram. The other one is the dynamic diagram. It looks like to me. I just wanted to understand whether this one, on the bottom, whether how should I read this, or whether I'm just confusing things. How should I read this? That to me, K is where the subjective process, the logic of subjective processes is established, and where the organization, which is the body on the left, is the subjective process, and on the left it's subjective organization. And then this movement is the movement from subjectivation to subjective process.
Reza, can I just clarify something? I just realized that there is a small confusion. In the previous diagram, the one that you read as saying on the left side, there was a political movement, and on the right side, there was a political communist world. What it actually said, which is what we call the communist hypothesis in our last text, what it actually suggested is that the space of political organization, so the space of possible ways that we combine value, community, and protocols when politically organizing is larger than the ways that the capitalist world or social worlds regularly combine capital, nation, and state. So
Okay,
the
good.
forms that
Okay.
property, community. So it's the claim is the communist hypothesis. So what makes
So the
this,
right side is a special case of left side.
yeah, the idea is the weird claim is that's why this is, let's say, a bit of a continuum hypothesis kind of thing, is that even though this is the local extension, a world where this is possible is bigger than a world where just this is possible, right? So
Okay, so in this
politically
case, I misread
organizing,
it.
yeah. So yeah, so I think yeah. So here is this is the left side includes all the ways we could politically experiment to build together movements, political organizations, things that might not be consistent, don't arrive at large synthesis of the world. But yeah, as you said, the right side, which is the capitalist world, defined by nation state and capital, it actually has a restricted kind of existence compared with that larger structure. So we were saying that the communist hypothesis is the claim there are more ways of organizing than the ones that are just the consistent gluing of mode C, A, and B under capital, nation, state. Then the communist idea would be a kind of a specific set of normative principles of how to glue generically A, B, and C that is not reducible to capital, but a specific one, right? The hypothesis is just that there is such a thing. The idea is a way of gluing. The experiments are the testing of that way of gluing is consistent, right? So we could actually distinguish a communist hypothesis, just the claim that there is this different cardinality to the political world and the social world. The communist idea would already give some body, right, to this, which is already, I think, what's going on with the slide that you guys were discussing afterwards.
Yeah, one thing I thought that I think hopefully dialogues with what Reza said. I mean, I feel a bit like this experience was like, and with Gabriel talked. Remember he talks about that, how this was organized by sort of temporal model, right, where you had the before and after. I don't remember. I remember you organizing. Yeah, but I mean, my point is that here you have the problem of taking power, right? So you have the before and after of the revolution. So you have first, like parties, and then you overthrown, and then this establishes a new order. And then at this point, when you're ready, you have the problem of the day after, and the revolution is already done, and then you have to organize it. I feel it gets this subjective sort of like interpretation, also because a lot of being like the sort of like a leftist was about of sort of like sustaining a difference from the existing left, right? Decision was like what militants experience, like that were against the communist parties, and the unions were sort of like facing, being able to sort of like do this division. I mean, I'm not sure if that makes sense, and I feel like what we're saying now is that this, I don't know if it's scission, but it gets like this materialist compositional interpretation of scalar problem. So there's no like before and after revolution. There's no like, but there's still this transitivity of small organization and revolution, but it is not like a sort of like temporal problem, and not just like the subjective in the sense of like holding up like subjectively something, but of actually composing stuff such that you get like a larger, both expanding movement, but also like this larger space of possibility. So you get the subjective and temporal gets thrown, I think, a bit to the scalar and compositional aspects. I don't know if you guys think this makes sense, but So I'm not sure how then, like, whether subjective process and subjectivization could be like just located here, because these are material like things. Like, I mean, we're normally more or less able to distribute stuff like in the real situation. It's not like someone that's divided between making a decision and kept like doing the wrong one, like capitulating. Is more like the compositions that are organized, something that its neighborhood does not see, like stuff in the exterior and stuff that is sort of like material. Its composition organizes a topology in which it's close both to the outside and the inside. So it's I feel there's no like clear subjective interpretation here. It's something a bit else, which it has a bit more of this like compositional. So and that's why I think it's also a bit weird, because here I've tried to interpret more like production and consumption, but it's not too clear what concretely like these two arrows could do. Like, because normally, like, I'm not sure, like, is it an exchange between, could it be like real exchanges between, like you have a cooperative, and the cooperative is constrained by laws of the market. So it has to, like, it's subject to pressures. And then you could say, like, once cooperatives federate, they create this interior space where stuff happens. What's the relationship between this interior space of, like socializing and like having goods in common, like common means of production, and what's this relation with these pressures outside? So I think it's not easy to describe this sort of like dynamics.
You know what it is, man? We're adding objective spirit back into Badiou. So we don't only have a theory of the subjective spirit, like generic self-transformation. Now we have the objective spirit as well, which is the logic of a relation between cooperatives. That's the subject. That statement, I don't think Badiou could make. I mean, he has all the tools to make it. He's not like an individual guy who says cognitive agents are the only form of subjectivity. But basically what we're doing is like showing that you can have a bit more Hegel as a tree, right? I mean, you can be materialistic about it, claim that a certain relational structure between cooperatives is the subject of the movement in a given moment. But that wouldn't fit in I mean, it's not contradictory, but it's not the same as the split between subjective process and subjectivization. For Badiou, I think it's a bit more at home with, discussion about technical objects, protocols, all these things that objectify a bit the way the subject exists in a given situation. Even though, I mean, Badiou ultimately, this is absolutely contained in his theory. I mean, sets, his whole point was giving truth a multiple, like a being, and saying, look, this is just a thing amongst things, just organized in a different way. But I don't think he ever got an example where that was the case, like the way that food circulates amongst community breakfasts amongst the Black Panthers. That's what carries a subjective mark. He would rather focus on a more Sartrean points of decision that kind of can be staged at a theater for militants. I don't think it's contradictory, but it's definitely more on the objective spirit side of the description, right? And I think that there is a very weird, I mean, very complicated argument to be made, which I think has a lot to do with an underlying, I mean, somebody very evil could do this, which is to then map it to the actual concrete situation. But there is a commonality amongst French thinkers, which is to think that capital presents itself in concrete situations in the form of the state, and everything which runs against the state has a form of a community. So everything that is generic is kind of mode A-ish. It's contradictory, it's paraconsistent. It's so cool to be contradictory, conflictual. reality is state-like, bureaucracy is bad, the state is the evil, and capital is usually, it doesn't get to have like a clear presence. It presents through the state, through a classical logic of identity, consistent groupings and so on. I think Badiou manages to break off of that more than others, more than Agamben, Nancy, Rancière, Lacan, all those guys that kind of think in these terms, but it's still there, right? The idea that just because you're paraconsistent doesn't mean anything good. I mean, that's like the easiest, the most common thing in the world, right? Exactly. And so, when you move back, I mean, I wonder what's the concrete. I mean, I do have my very evil theory that I've spoke to some of you, that post-war French philosophy is pretty much trying to redeem the that all the French could do during the war was like small resistance. So you get like micropolitics afterwards, which also has that structure. So capital is nowhere in sight. State is the realm of struggle. And below the state, small communities are more heroic, right? There's something to this, which might affect a bit the reason why he doesn't really thematize the inner structure of these things. It's kind of a given that they are, like young Hegel's subjective communities, the invisible church. That would be an amazing text on Badiou as a young Hegelian. That I haven't seen that yet, but yeah, that's such a nerdy topic. But definitely there is a weird vibe to this, that this is not developed, and that from what you're saying, I do think that it becomes clear. Not sure if it makes sense to you, Reza, but that there is this objective spirit flavor to it. And the thing that Dennis just mentioned, I think that we were already I'm pity that he just left, but it's something we've been talking about, right? Kind of, we can actually give a bit of we can already give a kind of a flavor to each mode.
I think the dominant logic is the objective spirit.
Yeah, I don't think that's necessarily so.
Because you're talking about, yeah, I mean, unless I misunderstand what you're saying, but in this case, I think we are talking about an embedded logic whereby the body basically moves toward a truth, or becomes subject to the truth, which is, yeah, I mean, it's very hard to differentiate them in Badiou, because I mean, you have subjectivization, a subjective process, and then at the same time you have what Badiou calls objective phenomenology. I mean, for sure, what happens within a world is something that is objective and subjective at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think we probably need to talk about, I mean, Hegel and Badiou would give a really cool conversation on its own. What I'm just suggesting, which might be more of like just a speculation on how to frame this difference between Badiou's, let's say, canonical interpretation and what I would call an extension or expansion of Badiou's frame. I don't think what Renzo is proposing breaks or is a critique. So it's not a matter of critiquing, but it is, I mean, it is ultimately, I mean, we were already aware of this, that in one sense, Badiou does propose something which is not in Hegel, which is, for Badiou, not every formal model of civil society is the state. That's not in Hegel. Like for mature Hegel, the set of, you know, every kind of the set of the ways in which spirit is objective presents itself to a people, that's called the state.
Mhm.
But the
That is
theory
true.
of the procedure is saying, no, there are infinite models of civil society which are not the state. That's the continuum hypothesis. That's the novelty that he's bringing up. And then our nasty Hegelian reproach is, fine, you want that one, but those models can themselves be, with many, you know, scare quotes, state-like, in the sense that they can be removed enough from the theory, from the theater of individual subjectivity to acquire a level of objective existence in rules, procedures, obligations to one another, and objects and technical relations.
Which I don't think Badiou denies. I don't think Badiou
Exactly,
denies
but
it.
he never wrote, never gave an example, never developed the inner structure of that argument, which is exactly what Renzo is doing. That's why I said it's an expansion, it's not a critique. Right? But it's not, I mean, in effect, it's not there, it's not written about.
So
And
there
I mean,
you go. Renzo is the redemption of Hegel
yeah, within the Badiouian system, it's very, very
within
small.
the Badiouian grammar.
Yeah, and I mean, it's postulated on something which is really beautiful, which is that there are two definitions for a topology, one starting from the interior, the other starting from the boundary, and depending which one you take, you know, you can get into this expansion. So it is something that was not there. And I do think that, I mean, Badiou, in his regular genius, he did anticipate this a bit, because he did say, you know, the mode of critique is probably not going to be the mode that takes us away from where we are right now. It's not going to get a new place by criticizing the previous one. Probably we're going to need to regionalize the previous one, meaning show that it's just it's describing a smaller space than it looked like. And in a certain way, this is a regionalization of Badiou's theory of the subject, where sure, it can be maintained through relations that exist mostly by decisions in the Sartrean sense of something which individual subjects need to tarry with in their actions, but that's perhaps a restricted parameter. It can, those decisions can also, you know, acquire more objective, spirity kind of nature, right? So it's Badiou, and even in the procedure of kind of moving away from a canonical reading. But just to make a remark, and I think we could go back to this, but yeah, I mean, paraconsistency, I take it to be very like something different from diagonal method or anything like this. Paraconsistent logic is a consistent, regular, rigorous logic. It's not, you know, a process to create the new. It might be the case that you create a novel thing in a situation in that way, but I mean, this is ultimately the reason why psychoanalysis is a bit distrustful of French political philosophy, because you work every day with people doing, you know, this paraconsistent acrobatics. That's like the ordinary part of analysis. So the idea that there's something inherently good in contradiction, self-reference, so on, I think it's a bit historically determined. You know, when did we start counting that being contradictory is politically powerful? I think that we started counting once after our French parents, you know, were communists but couldn't really do much about Nazi occupation in our country. I think it's very specific about post-war French philosophy and a bit of German. It's actually kind of funny, right? Italians, Germans, and French are kind of obsessed with this existential contradiction. I wonder what they have in common. But I find it to be historically specific and interesting to think about. why. Though we should, I mean, I take priests to be the opposite, to be somebody who want to show that this is ordinary, this is not, you shouldn't fetishize it, right? So yeah, anyway, this is a big discussion. I just think that it was good not to let the meeting end without kind of trying to flesh out the fact that there is an expansion to a canonical reading of Badiou in what Renzo is presenting.
Renzo, this is a work in progress, but any way that you can share this so I can go through it, or I can listen to the, because I missed part of the.
Yeah, of course. I'm gonna share the Figma link, and I'll try.
Sounds good.
I haven't been. I'll try to generate some slides also, PDF.
Yeah,
But man, just to conclude, I definitely think you're coming to a point where, you know, even if like the very brief kind of first summary of what you've done, like it's a second, I mean, now it's been 4 presentations because both were double, where you've explored this idea, you know, and there, the part about the calculus of identities, I think it's still a bit complicated, like the logic of reproduction with the arrows that go give the rounds around, but like the development on top of the boundary logic, I think it would be really good to have it on paper. And I mean, I think it will be like a really cool contribution. People definitely make use of it, you know.
You started to write it down, the notes. So.
Yeah, I'm gonna try with my last week notes, the note for last week's meeting. I'm gonna try just to summarize what I understood from it.
Yeah, I really, yeah, it was my plan for this year to try to write that all down also, so we can work on that.
Great.
Very cool.
Okay, guys. I mean, I can't imagine. I can't believe 10 people stayed for this absolutely crazy final part of the presentation. People are, everyone is a hero here.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Okay, everyone. So see you all next week. See ya.
Bye.
bye guys.